find paths that are successful for you to be even more successful as entrepreneurs. This part of the program is really focused on the entrepreneurs that are in our programs that are looking to grow. There's two different components, but the principal component is really to help you hear from others who have been successful at growing businesses. They'll share some of the strategies that they've used to both grow their operations as well as to succeed when speaking to funders. We want to try to create an environment where you can ask questions, where you can speak amongst yourselves and learn from each other. So as part of the day, we will be looking to have you participate in different ways. And since we are sort of running a little late and trying to stall here for a minute more, I want to sort of make sure that everyone has met those of you who are at your table and has had an opportunity to learn a little bit about their business, and you should really try to do that. And at the back at table 17, Flushing Bank is here, and they're happy to speak to anyone who thinks they might be interested in credit in particular. So on the panel, you'll be hearing from investors, but keep in mind that there's a credit person in the room. So if that's more appropriate for you. So part of why we're doing this is because today less than 3% of women entrepreneurs reach $1 million in revenues, and that's just a sad fact. And this is a national statistic. And we know from the research that part of it has to do with the fact that women just don't have a strong business network. That while they have great social networks, they have very weak business networks. And so part of what we want to encourage you to do here is to meet other women, and some of whom will be much more successful than you, so that you can begin to build your network of entrepreneurs who have achieved some success and who could be a support person for you and would understand the kind of challenges that you're going through. The day is designed to help you really kind of clarify what your priorities should look like if you're going to reach that next level of success. We have serial entrepreneurs participating throughout the day. I encourage you to try and speak with them when there's a break, because I think they offer a unique perspective on how to develop a formula for creating and launching businesses that can be successful. And we encourage you also to share your thoughts on Twitter. I believe we have the hashtag up, but for those of you who are avid Twitter followers, our hashtag is Bold Women Take Flight. So please join the conversation that is going on there and feel free to add your thoughts. So, today we want to stimulate your thinking about how to create ambitious but achievable expansion plans. We know that women are coming across many situations where gender bias can limit our opportunities. So to help you understand how to better navigate the world to achieve your goals, even when those require you to work with those who might have a different perspective than you, we want to share some ideas on what you could do to be more successful when approaching others, particularly men, for funding or for business opportunities. So our first session focuses on techniques that could help you be more successful. And leading that discussion is Jordan Birnbaum. He's a VP and Chief Behavioral Economist, Talent X at ADP Ventures. He's a serial entrepreneur. He has experienced both the highs and lows of owning a business. He was an investor in a startup production studio that was not successful until he relocated to Los Angeles and assumed management of the company, relaunching it under the name of Vanguard in 2004. Currently, he's the VP and Chief Behavioral Economist at ADP, where he directs the application of the principles of behavioral economies to new product development in the human capital management market. Please welcome Jordan Birnbaum as he starts the conversation today.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Maria. I appreciate that. How are we doing with sound? Can everybody hear me okay? Perfect. Okay, beautiful. I'll just keep remembering to project. Okay, so as Maria stated, I've had quite a roller coaster of a career involved in a lot of different startups, so I relate to what a lot of people are going through when you have good months and bad months and wonder if you're going to be able to keep the lights on. So I guess more than anything, I just want to start off by saying I empathize. I've been there too. And through all of that, I started to find over time some of my passions and what I enjoyed the most about entrepreneurship. And it turned out that I was incredibly interested in the science of motivation. And that led me to industrial and organizational psychology, which led me to behavioral economics. And my hope today is to provide you guys with a little bit of understanding about this new science that's emerging and gaining a lot of popularity, and then think and talk about how this could apply to specific situations that you guys deal with, and hopefully give you the opportunity to incorporate new ideas so that when you're facing different kinds of challenges, you have some thoughts about how best to address them. So for today, we're going to be talking about foundationally, what is this science? What does it mean? How can we understand it? And how is it applicable to us? And then we'll get into some of the things that we can understand about gender bias by considering the fields of both psychology and behavioral economics. And then talk a little bit about how specifically this group can use some of these principles both to support business goals, and as entrepreneurs, I think more than most, we know that oftentimes what we're doing in business is a reflection of what's happening in our lives. And so we'll talk a little bit about more how we can set ourselves up for success in making some of the changes that we want to make, whether it's in business, in life, or both. And so before we move on, I suppose the last question that you might have is, why are there several pictures of audiences seemingly having a wonderful time? And the answer is because I'm priming you to find the rest of this presentation utterly delightful. So you can tell me afterwards whether or not it worked, but that's the first example of behavioral economics, actually. And one of the nice things about BE, as I will sometimes call it, is that even if I tell you what I'm doing, it doesn't make it any less effective, at least theoretically. You can tell me afterwards if I'm wrong about that. Okay, so I am sorry right off the bat, this is the worst it's going to be, but to talk about behavioral economics, usually the best starting place is classical economics, which is very dry, and I promise I'll go through this really quickly. But ultimately, economics is about making predictions. Economists build models, and they put various inputs into those models, and then the models will spit out predictions. So for example, oh, you know what? I was supposed to set my timer, and I forgot, so let me make sure I do that. Sorry, everyone. Okay. So, for example, we might say, well, we know what the demand is for a particular resource, and we know what the supply is of a particular resource, so by understanding those inputs, we can then predict something like, what's the price going to be? And then it gets infinitely complex from there. But the point is that for these models to work, it requires that we make certain assumptions about human beings who are participating in these markets. And they can be pretty interesting. So for example, if our models are going to work, we have to assume that all people have access to full and relevant information. And we know that's probably not terribly realistic. But when it comes to behavioral economics, there's one assumption in particular that is extremely important. In classical economics, for models to work, we have to assume that human beings are perfectly rational actors. And I just want to say that when I was looking for a picture to demonstrate that, in fact, it is silly to say that human beings are perfectly rational actors, the number of choices that I had were disturbingly plentiful. But I figured, you know, the old surge saver in the swimming pool was a good place to start to make the point. So, we're done with economics. Hooray. But now we're into the more interesting stuff. So, unlike classical economics, where we are trying to make guesses about other factors based on assumptions about human beings, we're more interested in how human beings actually behave. And as a result, behavioral economics has become very associated with the word irrational or irrationality. And as it's become more popular, I get to make the joke that irrational is the new black. So because we're moving from sort of speculations on how logical and self-interested behaviors would look, we're now instead moving into the place where logic is no longer driving. And as a result, despite its name, behavioral economics is actually much more about psychology than it is about economics. In fact, the word economics is more there to talk about how we can take our understanding of human behavior and then make predictions and put that understanding to good use. And just to sort of reinforce the point, the assumptions of rationality, along with a few other assumptions about human behavior, such as willpower or selfishness, these are the things that we're abandoning. There are no more assumptions about human beings. The point is to observe human beings and see what's real and what's actually happening. Now, this is not meant to diminish the importance of classical economics. In fact, it's hugely important that we understand what logical and rational behavior looks like, so that we can create sort of aspirational models and understand where we're going wrong. Sorry about that. Talking with your hands at a podium apparently is more dangerous than it looks. Okay, when we talk about what irrationality means in the field of behavioral economics, I think it's important that we get a little bit more nuanced in our understanding of what we're talking about so that we can understand sort of what's happening in the background. And so I'm going to give just a few examples. I could fill up the whole day with examples of behavioral economics, but here are a few of my favorites, just to give you a sense of what we're dealing with. And so one of the more powerful tools of the science is something called the framing effect. And rather than describe it, I'm just going to start off by giving you an example. A doctor could say to a patient who needs a very serious surgical procedure, you're going to need this procedure, and I have to tell you that 90% of the patients who have had this procedure in the past have survived and gone on to live a happy life. Or the doctor could also say, you're going to need this procedure, and I have to tell you that 10% of the patients who have received this procedure in the past have unfortunately passed away. Now, human beings, understandably, are going to have a very different reaction to these two approaches of explaining what's happening. And it's very understandable. I myself would have a totally different reaction based on what the doctor said, and I know this stuff. And yet, this is the exact same piece of information, and that we would have a different reaction to it despite the fact that it's the same. That's what we mean by irrational. So that's one kind of example of the irrationality that we're talking about. And the idea here is that it's not stupidity, it's not a breakdown in mental thought, it's what's happening at an unconscious level that we don't even have time to stop, notice, and think about, that's then therefore driving our behavior. And so this is one example. Let's look at another. This is a great experiment that I love. A very important behavioral economist named Dan Ariely did this experiment. And he basically approached two groups, and he said to them, assume that you've decided that you want to subscribe to The Economist. And so in the first group, he provided two pricing options. And he said, now, you could choose to get online access only for $59 a year, or you could get both online and print magazines sent to you, and that would be $125 a year. And he was looking to see what the basic breakdown and appeal of these different options were. And so in the first group, about 32% of people said, yeah, if I was going to subscribe to The Economist, I would want to save some money and do the online only. But 68% said, actually, once I'm doing it, I want to do it. I want to be able to access it online. I'd like to receive the old print magazines in the mail. So that's where he sort of established his baseline. That's what would be called the control group. Then he moves to the experimental group, where he only changes one thing. And in this case, you'll see that he put in a third pricing option. And what you'll notice is that the third pricing option is just ridiculously stupid. Who on earth would ever spend $125 a year for print only when they could also have online and print? So it's a very obviously flawed offer. And as a result, because it's ridiculous, it really shouldn't have any impact on us, right? Wrong. So it turns out that it's true, nobody selected the second decoy option, but look at what it did to demand. Now, if you're the economist and you're making more money off of your print magazines than you are off your online, this is probably pretty important to know. And so what this is showing us is how a piece of irrelevant information or an irrelevant option can skew our perception of value, because we're now comparing the online and print offer to the print-only offer for the same price. So it makes it a much more obvious choice. The problem is, once again, this doesn't really make sense. And so this would be another example of the sort of subtlety of irrationality that behavioral economics takes a look at. Okay, this is a very famous case. I'm actually not even going to, well, I'll probably talk because I can't help myself, but let's go through it together. So we're meeting a young woman named Linda, who is 31 years old, very bright. She majored in philosophy, great major, hard to get a job, but really interesting conversations at dinner. As a student, she was deeply concerned about things that matter, which is cool. Linda is becoming more likable by the moment. Finally, she has participated in pro-environmental demonstrations. So this is a brief description about a hypothetical person named Linda. And so what I'm going to ask is, which of the following two alternatives is more probable? One, that Linda is a bank teller, or two, that Linda is a bank teller and active in the feminist movement. And just in case you're visual thinkers, there's a picture of Linda to help you conceptualize your choice. So if this group is representative of the hundreds of thousands of people who have seen this description since the 70s, about 85% of you have chosen option 2. And 85% of you are unfortunately wrong. I was part of the 85% the first time I saw this as well. I assumed that it was more likely, given what I knew, that Linda would be a bank teller active in the feminist movement. The problem is that I committed something called the conjunction fallacy. And that basically describes the fact that it is literally impossible for two events combined to ever be more likely than one event happening on its own. And just to give you an example, and I'll go to the absurd to make the point, what's more likely to happen tomorrow? That you get a flat tire, or that you get a flat tire and the person who stops to help you is wearing a football helmet and carrying an umbrella? Of course, the answer is it's more likely that you get only a flat tire. So that would be another example of how our mind is playing tricks on us and is leading us to answers and choices that feel right, but in fact, if we take a step back and consider it purely from a logical perspective, is not right. And so when we say irrational, we're talking about things that are happening at an unconscious level that are baked into how we operate as human beings. And it leads us to making what we would refer to as systemic errors, that will make the same kind of errors over and over again, and we may not even be aware of it. So the big question is why? Why would we be prone to these kinds of things? And there's a pretty reasonable answer. It's that we're not that smart. And I say that, of course, with a little bit tongue-in-cheek, because, of course, we're actually amazingly smart. But the truth is that the human brain and what we can do with it is limited. There is far too much information in the world for us to process. We can't pay attention to everything. We don't have the opportunity to think things through. We are subject to making decisions and processing perceptions based on incomplete information with insufficient time. And we have our own issues of irrationality to deal with. We may find certain realities difficult to bear emotionally, and so we'll have an unconscious bias skewing how we perceive what's happening, even to provide us with some sense of emotional safety. So there's a lot contributing to why we have to process so many things unconsciously and just react. If we didn't, we wouldn't make it out of the apartment in the morning. But the point is that as we understand that sort of bigger picture, we can then start to break it down into behaviors and processes that are actually a little bit more predictable. And this is what's going to end up being very important to us, is that irrational does not mean the same thing as unpredictable. In fact, irrationality can be quite predictable. There are all sorts of situations where we can reproduce the same kind of irrationality and therefore make the conclusion that these various contributing circumstances are what lead to this kinds of behavior. And in breaking that down into smaller components, there's two really big concepts that drive a lot of behavioral economics. They're called heuristics and biases. Now, heuristics are quite literally mental shortcuts. These are things that we do, they are coping mechanisms to help us live in the world. So we do things like we will overestimate the probability of an event based on how fresh it is in our minds. So, for example, after Hurricane Katrina, we all would have rated the likelihood and probability of a devastating flood as much higher a week and a half after it happened than we would today. And that's because the images of Hurricane Katrina would have been so fresh in our minds. And so that availability to that mental picture is having a huge impact on how we perceive the likelihood of that kind of thing happening. I'm not going to go through all of the different heuristics. Part of my job is knowing where cognitive load stands, which means that when we try to overwhelm people with too much information, they lose it all. So I'm going to leave it at that. What I will say, though, is that if you find this stuff interesting, at the end of the presentation, I'm going to go through a couple of books that you might find really interesting, where you can learn everything that you possibly would want to about this subject. But besides from heuristics, they're not the only thing that contribute to our systematic errors. There's also this concept called biases, which I'm guessing you've heard of. In fact, I think quite appropriately, most of us have developed a bias against the word bias, and it's because we tend to associate it with some of the less appealing aspects of our species' nature. But in truth, biases merely describe a tendency, and they're neither good nor bad. I could have a bias towards eating food instead of lead, so that's probably a pretty good bias. Or I could have a bias to want to give up my seat to someone who looks uncomfortable on the subway. That's a good bias. So biases by themselves are not bad. They're just tendencies where we just get an immediate feeling that allows us to skip past having to think. Now, it's appealing to call us lazy and to think of human beings as lazy in this regard, but that's really misleading, because if we weren't lazy, again, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't have made it. We need to think and fast forward, oftentimes, even for our own safety and protection. Nonetheless, while sometimes it works for us, very often it works against us. And so some of the descriptions up here, stereotypes, I think we're all familiar with. Confirmation bias describes the process whereby when you're taking in new information, if it confirms what you already believe, you're likely to embrace that information. But if it challenges what you already believe, you're likely to reject that information, which describes why when Republicans and Democrats speak with each other, nobody hears anything, because they're only using the information that supports their case. So there's a couple of more biases, but there's one that feels particularly relevant to today, and that is, in fact, gender bias. And the reality is that whether we're consciously aware of it, there are feelings that aren't really processed and aren't considered logically, nonetheless that hold powerful sway. And they drive our interactions, they drive our perceptions, and unfortunately they lead us to making some systemic errors. And as a result, there are kind of two different paths that I think that we can take once we realize that this is happening. One is, of course, just increasing awareness. The more that we understand what's happening and that we're aware of it, the more likely we are to notice it and to start taking action to improve on it. But the other is sometimes, I would consider that one almost more like defense, like trying to stop this thing from happening. But sometimes you also have to go on offense, which means that when you're in the midst of pursuing your goals, if this is something that's going to get in your way, then we need to have a plan for how are we going to bypass this stuff. And so we're going to be talking about that in just a little while. So what is behavioral economics? Behavioral economics is really, it exists on two levels, which I just mentioned. The first is using the scientific method to identify and validate that these things exist. Different heuristics that all human beings employ, different biases that human beings show with great consistency and reliability. And so the science of identifying those is obviously hugely important because we can't address something until we understand it. But then the question becomes, well, what are you going to do with that knowledge and information? And that is the applied side of behavioral economics. It's part of what I do and a lot of other behavioral economists do, is we take this knowledge that we have and we look at different situations and say, how can we use our understanding of how human beings behave or how they think in order to be as effective as we possibly can, particularly, and for the ethical behavioral economists, to help people avoid making choices that work against their own self-interests. And that's why behavioral economics has become very important in public health, in public policy. It also, on the somewhat darker side, has become very important in advertising and marketing. But one of the delineations there, when you're thinking about this science and this practice, is, are you trying to help someone make a decision that's good for them, or are you trying to help someone make a decision that's good for you? This is an unfortunate reality of our field. It's not a question of whether or not people would try to use behavioral economics against your own self-interest. It's been happening for decades. So what we can do about it is, one, spread awareness of it just so that it is less likely to be effective. And then the other is, for practitioners, be open about it. For me, as I mentioned earlier, there has been research done, and letting people know about the behavioral economics techniques that you're trying to use does not impact their effectiveness. And so one way to tell an ethical behavioral economist is when they're pointing out exactly what they're doing, trying to help people make the best decisions. So that's how behavioral economics is functioning now in society. And for our purposes today, I tried to think about how could we make this most relevant to this particular group. And I wouldn't say, in fact, that the defining characteristic of this group is gender. I would say, actually, it's entrepreneurship. And so towards that end, were this a different group, I would probably talk about what are some of the challenges that women face in organizations, in large organizations, and how, what are some strategies people could use to position themselves to meet their career aspirations? Or I might talk about, as an organization, what can you do to promote greater awareness of gender bias in the workplace and take actions to mitigate the impact of it? But for this group, you're interested in starting your own businesses, or you're already running your own businesses. And so I think that there's two really significant aspects of how behavioral economics can apply specifically to this group. And the two that occur to me are leadership, which is both running your organizations both as they are now and as we move forward. And then a second is fundraising, which, as Maria mentioned, is something that is of particular importance as we try to scale up our operations. Many of you may have be in a position where you're either proving a concept or you've proven a concept, and now the question is, how can we make it big? And oftentimes, it's very hard to do on your own. It requires being connected to people with access to capital, to important strategic relationships. And so as a result, when we say fundraising, we're talking about not only getting access to funds, but also getting access to expertise and to connections. So as we go through, I'm going to start off with leadership. And I have to share with you that as I was putting this presentation together, my original intention was to first talk about, okay, what have we learned about gender bias in leadership? What do we know about how, if a man and a woman did the exact same job, how they would be evaluated by their peers? What might we know about when a woman ascends into a new managerial position? What kinds of resistance she is likely to encounter from a team. And these things all exist, and they've all been documented using the scientific method so that we don't have a question about whether or not it's real. But what I did realize was, as I was looking at where we are with the science, that we're past that. And I think that that's really exciting news. And so I came to realize that I shouldn't give any air to the gender biases that have existed in leadership for years, because they're starting to matter a lot less. And so what I'm happy to say is that instead, when it comes to leadership, I'm only going to share with you some scientific findings. And I think that the conclusions from these hopefully will be self-evident. So these are 3 reputable studies. They have been peer-reviewed and then were written about in Harvard Business Review, and they're all from within the last 5 years. And I would say that that's some pretty compelling evidence about how women are doing in leadership. What is exciting is that a lot of different factors are starting to come together to give us more insight into what's actually happening. Not only are the progress that we've made over the last 50, 75 years is obviously has taken hold and taken root, but it's also given us the opportunity now to start building up decades worth of data. And so we're no longer having to guess, we're no longer having to make intuitive statements, and we're no longer having to make aspirational statements saying, like, wouldn't it be great if? Now we have the data to know. So if you had a suspicion that adding more women to the C-suite would lead to greater profitability, you were right. And if you started to suspect, I know men are supposed to be sort of more aspirational, or at least that's how they're sort of perceived. But actually, I see women making bolder choices at work. Yeah, you're correct. And when I've thought about sort of some of my male and female bosses, I realized actually, yeah, the women have been better bosses. And apparently that wasn't just my own experience. And sort of as I looked at these stats, which I thought were really exciting and really important, it reminded me of another study that's hugely important that I came across in my IO background, industrial and organizational psychology. And this was an article in 2003 by the social scientists were Ely and Carley. And what was special about this was that there had been enough experiments run that were looking at what were the impacts of men and women in leadership positions, that there was sufficient data to do what's called a meta-analysis. A meta-analysis is a very specific kind of statistical analysis that is able to look at multiple studies from multiple contexts and aggregate them into one massive study to look for trends. And it was by 2003 that sort of the next level of meta-analysis was even possible. Now, before I go into the findings of this, it's important to establish the idea of transformational versus transactional leadership, which is a very heavy organizational psychology concept, but one that has gained pretty wide acceptance over the last 25 years. And it's this idea that as a leader, there's kind of two different ways that we can drive motivation in our teams. So the first is called transactional, and it's exactly as it sounds. Your motivation is based on a transaction. You're doing your job to get a salary. You're doing your job well to be eligible for a promotion. Everything is a trade. Transactional leadership is linked to extrinsic motivation, which of the two motivations is weaker. Extrinsic means I'm doing this for a reward or to avoid a punishment. Transformational leadership, on the other hand, is linked with intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation means I'm doing this because I want to. Not surprisingly, transformational leadership is far more impactful. It gets people motivated because they believe in a vision, because they want to contribute to the team, and it drives people to much, I knew that was going to happen, to much greater heights. I've got to like hold my hands behind my back or something. So looking at men and women from the perspective of transactional versus transformational leadership, this is what they found. Men are more likely to be transactional leaders. That's a stat that stands on its own. It doesn't mean more likely than women. It means more than 50% of men end up leading in a transactional manner. And what it looks like is kind of what we described. And this is what happens in organizations that are being driven by transactional leadership. Women, on the other hand, are more likely to be transformational leaders, which means that with any woman leader, there's a better than 50% chance that she is, in fact, a transformational leader. And these are the results that happen there. And so I guess for me, the big conclusion and the big takeaway was that as you move forward in your careers as leaders, it's possible that people will talk to you about gender bias and how you should behave and how to be a leader. And my message to you is tell them to shut up, because in fact, when it comes to leadership, you're winning. You're doing it better. And so my ultimate message about this is don't believe anything that you hear about leadership and how it ought to be. Be true to yourself, because that's working better. And this isn't just a nice thing to say. It's not an aspirational statement. This is science. The same science that gives us medicine and put a human being on the moon is what produced these findings. So I hope that everyone is confident in knowing that your intuition as a leader is likely right, is more likely than not to be right. And so trust yourselves on that front. Now, on the flip side, this one isn't as nice. This is looking specifically at what happens in fundraising efforts and how does gender bias play itself out in those regards. And so we're going to talk about two fairly recent studies, both of which have appeared in the Harvard Business Review. And this first was looking at different meetings at a TechCrunch, a recent TechCrunch, which is a big tech conference where a lot of networking and fundraising happens. And what they found was that men and women were asked very different types of questions when speaking with investors. And they found that they categorized the questions that were put forth to men as promotion questions. And so it was all about aspirations, about where are you going, what are you going to achieve, and really framing things in a very sort of strong light and a positive-looking regard. And so the way questions were asked made it very easy to focus on the future. Women, on the other hand, tended to be asked questions that they were putting into the category of a prevention mindset, very much looking at the present, more focused on security than on growth. And so the problem is that before anyone even had a chance to speak, the conversations were already framed to be heavily biased towards success for men and a lack of success for women, because investors aren't interested in safe, investors want growth. And so this was a confirmation of what I am sure many people in this room have experienced, that even the questions that are asked to you are loaded and make the playing field uneven. And that's a really important thing for us to know and to keep in mind, because from a behavioral economics perspective, our first step is understand the biases, and then our second step is using our understanding of the biases to make things better. And I guess this is more just to kind of reiterate the point of what's happening. A second study occurred about gender bias in VC fundraising. This one happened in Sweden. And Sweden's an interesting case because most of their venture capital, or maybe not most, but a great chunk of it is actually government funded. And you might think that perhaps if it's a government-funded environment, that maybe there's a slightly better split between how VC money is distributed. And the answer is it's not. It's just as bad as it is here in the States. But to their credit, the Swedish government gave researchers the opportunity to listen, not during the pitches, but after the pitches, to hear how investors spoke about men versus women. And again, I'm sure this is not surprising to you. They found that identical attributes could be described in different ways that for men were seen as positives and for women were seen as detractors. So if a man was young, it was promising, but if a woman was young, she was inexperienced. If a man demonstrated caution, he was sensible. If a woman demonstrated caution, she was risk-averse. And we found that when it came to things like credibility, experience, and knowledge, again, the same kinds of attributes and data points were leading to very different perceptions and conclusions. And once again, from a behavioral economics point of view, what matters for us is that we understand what's happening, we can anticipate what's going to happen, and so we can go into it with a plan for how we're going to make sure that we don't fall victim to this. So, with that in mind, I want to talk about just a couple of strategies for how to overcome it. But as I was writing this, I realized there's a really important point that has to be made, which is that this isn't okay. And by my sharing with you some strategies about how to overcome this stuff, doesn't mean that it's all right or that it's fair or anything. I think most clear-thinking people would embrace a meritocracy. We want people to be evaluated based on the merits of their ideas, of their performance, of their strengths and their attributes. And so I'm not standing up here just trying to say something that I think would be appealing to this group, but rather what I hope would be the clear and objective-minded conclusion when looking at these things. So that's a long way of saying that I don't think it's right that this is something that you need to think about, but it is. It is in reality. Not fair, but true. So therefore, let's talk a little bit about what are some things that we can do as we're heading into these conversations. So the first is this idea of reframing a conversation. For example, if an investor is framing the conversation in terms of what is your current performance, and they're really focused on trying to poke holes in your current performance, when you're answering them, you can either try to defend your business model, which is likely setting up kind of an unconscious mental construction that validates the questions of the potential investor. Instead, when you're answering, you should try very much to frame those questions in terms of, yes, but what am I going to achieve when I get my funding? How are we going to change that? And try to drive your answers back into that kind of aspirational, forward-thinking mindset, because that's where investors are likely to get swept back up into that, and it might mitigate somewhat of the bias of where they're heading. Redirecting the questions, similar concept. I would say, don't do it like politicians do, where they just don't answer the question. That would not work. But I like to think about if you get a question that you don't think sets up your pitch well, my suggestion is think of your answer as a first half of the sentence and a second half of the sentence. And in the first half of the sentence, address the question. But in the second half of the sentence, redirect it. So going back to our past example, If an investor says, well, I see that you have a customer retention rate of 65%, why do you think, what's contributing to that? Again, that's very stuck in the present. It's not looking forward. It's not likely to work out well for you. And you can say, well, what we've seen is that of the 35% of the customers we lose, more than 80% are due to a lack of follow-up. And we don't have the resources for follow-up. So once we secure our funding, this is how we're going to improve upon it. So it's reframing those examinations to look forward, because that's where their mindsets are when they're talking to men. And data shows us that that's what's more likely to get them to write the check. Okay, anticipating stereotypes. I feel very strongly about this one. And I guess what we've come to realize is it's sort of unavoidable. When you're meeting people for the first time, no matter what, they are filling in assumptions about you based on things that have nothing to do with you. So they are defining you in their own minds even as you're speaking. And the only thing that you can do to stop that is to define yourself. And so when you're meeting with new investors, I would say even early, very directly, vocally, and in a way that can't be ignored, you tell them who you are. And don't allow them to pull on their past assumptions to define you. And I think that it is a strong move to tell people who you are pretty upfront. And let's bypass this from ever becoming a possibility that people can use these systematic errors in judgment when they're evaluating you. You need to take the bull by the horns in that regard. Drawing comparisons. Again, what we're trying to do here is to access people at an unconscious level. And so what we want to do is for them to associate your business with other businesses that have succeeded in the past. So if you know the story about how Google started and how they almost sold for $500,000 but didn't, I guess they're kind of happy about that. By the way, Yahoo had the chance to buy them for $500,000 and turned it down, which not a great choice. But the point is that the more that you can start to reframe your business with other businesses with whom they have this association of success, the better off you're going to be. Also, identifying commonalities. A lot of times, investors will be vocal about what it is that they look for and what defines an appealing investment to them. Don't assume that they'll make the connection between their stated principles and your business model. It's better for you to be very explicit in pointing that out. Because if you can make that case convincingly, you'll trigger something called consistency theory, which says that we very strongly are motivated to be consistent with our past statements. So this is a technique that you can use to identify how your business aligns with their stated goals. And then finally, given what I'm talking about, this probably isn't a surprise, but data is the enemy of assumptions. And so many unconscious assumptions are what run or what create these problems. To the extent that you can come in with strong data and strong research, and the more that you can center your presentation around unquestionable facts, the harder it is for people to revert to stereotypes and make some unconscious judgments that wouldn't work in your favor quite unfairly. Okay, we're into the home stretch. So, as we're talking about making changes in how we interact with people in our business and in generating funds and creating our networks, there's kind of a parallel with things in our lives. And so I thought it would be a good idea to just briefly talk about habits. Habits are very related to everything that we're talking about in that they happen unconsciously. They're not happening based on conscious directed thought. Perhaps at one point they were when they were first becoming habits, but then over time it becomes muscle memory. So habits are extremely important to our lives. They have a huge degree of impact on what happens with us, both personally and professionally. And so from that angle, I have to say I just recently read this book. It's wonderful. It's by a He's a journalist with the New York Times, a man named Charles Duhigg, but this book has been, I think, really important for a lot of people, where he is able to articulate how important habits are, how hard it is to build them and change them, but that it's doable. And so there were three main ideas that he describes in the book that I thought were worth just kind of going through with you guys so that we can think about where this might apply in our lives. So the first idea of understanding habits is that they exist in three parts. There is a cue, which is the thing that tells you, like, it's time to do something. There's the routine, which is the actual behavior that you take. And then there is the reward, which is what you feel after having taken the behavior. So let's go with smoking. The cue would be the urge for a cigarette. You feel like you need to go out and have one. The routine is taking out a cigarette and lighting it. The reward, maybe it's the deep breath, maybe it is the feeling of nicotine in the brain, but people aren't thinking about, should I have a cigarette now? What's this going to do to my long-term health? They just feel the cue, and they unthinkingly engage in the routine and have the reward. Same is true for eating. Perhaps the cue is your stomach rumbles, the routine is you grab some unhealthy food, and the reward is you're no longer uncomfortable. So you can look at all of your habits and realize that they all break down in this way. And this is really meaningful because if you want to change a habit or build new habits, there's a couple of important things to know. And the first is what he calls the golden rule of habits. And the idea here is that there's no such thing as killing an old habit or creating a new habit. It's just changing habits. You can't just stop something. Nor can you just start something, but you can change. And where he says to change is not in the cue and not in the reward, but in the routine. So going back to the smoking example, if you want to change your habit to not become a smoker, when you feel the urge for that cigarette, what's going to be the new routine? Perhaps the new routine is instead you're going to sit on your hands and take 10 deep breaths. Then the reward, theoretically, should be closer to what you experience when you light a cigarette, which is that you're breathing deeply, you're calming down, you're unplugging for a moment. Now, by the way, I have no idea if sitting on your hands and taking deep breaths actually works for quitting smoking. It was just a really cool example that came to me last night. So maybe I'll try and find some smokers and see if that can help. But beyond the golden rule of habits, there's this other concept that I think is really important. It's called Keystone habits. And these are things in our lives where one habit affects many others. So for example, if you can embrace the habit of exercising every day, suddenly the habit of going to sleep at a reasonable hour becomes much easier. Eating well becomes much easier. And so as you look through your life, whether personally or in business, you can start to think about, well, what habits would then set up other habits to succeed? And so these are some things that we can do that will put us in a position to try to have a best chance of making some real changes in how we're behaving ourselves. And so finally, I thought it would be fun to just share with you, these are, we'll call them willpower hacks, because when you're changing a habit and the cue comes up, it will take some willpower to change your routine. You're going to have to want to do that. And so within behavioral economics, we take what we understand about how we ourselves operate and start to make some rules, some actions or techniques that will support some of that willpower. So the first one is called hot and cold planning. We as human beings, whenever we're feeling extremely anything, angry, sad, frustrated, that's called happy, confident, anything that's extreme, that's considered a hot state. A cold state is when we're a little bit more detached, we're not very emotional, we're probably feeling a little bit more analytical. And it's important that we understand that because we should only make plans in a cold state. So let me just give you the most obvious example of that. What happens when you go to the supermarket and you're starving? You buy so much of the worst stuff. Your hunger is putting you in a hot state. But if you go to the grocery store in a cold state when you're feeling fine, you're likely to make much better decisions, buy healthier food, not as much of it. So that would be a terrific example there. Commitment contracts. So when we make commitments to other people, we tend to value them more than commitments that we make to ourselves. It shouldn't be that way, but we as human beings, even goes back to evolution. The idea of sort of like the herd mentality, that if back when we were traveling in packs of, well, I don't want to even get into the evolution debate, but the idea is that if you were excommunicated from the herd, your life was very much in danger. And so we are hardwired to sort of be in the group, which explains why social pressure has such an impact on us. So with commitment contracts, we can try to curb our behavior by making commitments to other people. So one example of that would be, if you have a hard time getting out of bed in the morning, start scheduling meetings for 9 a.m. and you will get out of bed in the morning, because not going to the gym and working out doesn't really have ramifications for you. Consistently showing up to early meetings with your boss, that has some ramifications for you, and you will find the motivation. Temptation bundling. This is much simpler than it sounds. It just means reward yourself when you're good. So if there is something that you really like and something that you really don't like but you have to do, put them together. And so one very common example of this is that for every hour I put in the gym, I get 2 hours of Netflix. So that is a way to build motivation and make sure that you follow through, more so than if there was no consequence to whether or not you go to the gym. Socializing intentions. This is kind of like a commitment contract, but instead of making a commitment in this case, it's merely letting other people know what it is that you're trying to do. That tends to boost our motivation to follow through, knowing that other people are witness to it and could in fact judge it. And so I'm trying to make this as relevant as possible. Yes, Facebook counts. So if you make an announcement on Facebook, for all intents and purposes here, that counts. You have let people know what it is that you're trying to do, and you now have a new level of motivation to stay committed to it. And then this last one is one of my favorites. It's almost hard for me to believe that it's true, but it is. When you write down a goal, you are 50% more likely to achieve it. 50. However, typing does not equal writing. This doesn't count. You actually need to grab a pen and a piece of paper and write it down. For whatever reason, typing out our goals does not lead to an increase in the likelihood that we achieve them, but writing it down with a pen has a huge impact. I can't tell you why it is, I just know that it works. So this is certainly something that I think everyone can do, because clarifying what you want to intend and putting it out there beyond just your own mind somehow seems to make it more real for us. Okay, so as promised, if this subject is interesting to you, if you think that behavioral economics is fascinating, and most people do because it's about us, and I think on some level we're all inherently narcissists, which kind of makes sense. But nonetheless, if it's something that you want to read more about, I just threw this slide together. I would say that these are the 4 most important books written about behavioral economics, and there is literally nothing that we've talked about today that these books don't cover in enormous detail. They're incredibly well written, they're fun reads, except for the last one. The last one is really hard. So I would say, in fact, if you wanted to read these, do it in that order. And I think that if you enjoyed what we talked about here, these books can be very meaningful to you and will help you also sort of not only internalize these understandings, but you will start to have your own brainstorms about how you can use this information to set up your business right, whether it's how you interact with your customers, how you interact with your employees, how you interact with investors, or what kinds of marketing strategies that you want to employ. And then I just want to point out, I knew that if I did my job even halfway decent, that a lot of people would take a picture of this slide, which is why at the very bottom I put in a little plug for my own blog. Now, I do this every single time that I talk about behavioral economics. I always share this same slide, and I just want you to know that when I point out that I put my blog there, it's much more successful in generating a chuckle than it is in actually generating any traffic to the blog. But nonetheless, I will continue and cross my fingers. So with that, I just want to say again, I am inspired by this group of people. I think that the intention of coming together and building strength through shared experiences and new relationships is absolutely the best thing that we can be doing. I applaud all of you for your courage in pursuing your dreams in business. I have done it too. It is scary. And I'll tell you, now that I'm working at a big company, one of the things that I forgot is it's nice to have somebody else come around and pat you on the back and say, hey, great job. It's nice to have your efforts appreciated by other people. It's nice to feel like you're not in it by yourself. And that's probably something that many of you haven't experienced in a long time. And so I guess I would recommend that you keep an awareness of that and remind yourself to be both kind to yourself and remember that there are some fundamental things that as the boss you don't get, and think about what they are, don't shrug them off, and try to find other ways to fulfill that. And that could be through support groups like this, it could be through friends, it could be through various networking events. But remember, just because there's nobody there telling you that you're doing a great job doesn't mean you're not doing a great job. And with that, I want to say thank you, and if there are any questions, I'd be more than happy to take them now. So thank you very much. All right. Oh, hi. Me too.
I'm wondering if you've ever done a version of this talk or do something you can share now that includes some intersectionality, so not just about gender, but also class, sexuality, and race.
Yes, unquestionably there are patterns that we can pick up that are cultural, and so I guess with regards to demographic, I would put that under more of a sort of a cultural aspect of it, sort of how we're socialized to think. So I personally, most of my efforts have been the application of behavioral economics within the field of industrial and organizational psychology. So the majority of my stuff is, or my focus has been within work and the work environment and how we can leverage these understandings to create healthier work environments, healthier dynamics, healthier relationships at work, because that leads to better things for everyone. But I can say unreservedly that there are a lot of experts out there who can talk about how various elements of class, age, geography influence different perceptions. So, for example, when people are going abroad for international assignments, an enormous amount of training is necessary beforehand to allow people to understand what is the culture into which they're submerging themselves, how are they likely to be perceived, and what can they do to sort of smooth out any of those unfounded assumptions. So one example that comes to mind is that there are certain cultures where direct communication is embraced, and there are other cultures where direct communication is shunned. And so it's incumbent upon us as we enter into a new culture to understand how those things are going to be received and that to shape our behaviors to circumvent those potential problems. So I think that there are a lot of different ways that we can take that kind of information and understand how it plays itself out, and then how we can strategize to use that understanding to everyone's advantage. And so, yes, I would say that as you do a little bit of research on behavioral economics relative to class or geography, that you will probably find more stuff on Google Scholar than you could get through in a year. All right, well, oh, sorry, hi.
In terms of transformational leadership versus transactional. It occurred to me that everything seems to be transactional because if people feel better about themselves under certain circumstances or that's the motivation, well, that's kind of transactional too. Could you please illustrate a little bit more of what transformational motivation looks like?
Yes, that's actually a wonderful point, and it kind of reminds me of that idea of like, is philanthropy actually selfish? Are people giving money so that they can feel good about themselves? And to that question, I would say, who cares, as long as they're giving. When it comes to transformational leadership, I think that, yes, you're right. So, for example, on my team at work, I'm lucky enough that I currently work for what I would consider to be a transformational leader. And I guess the point is that when it's 6:30 p.m. and I'm exhausted, and by all rights, I can go home and still feel good about myself, but I know that my colleague is going to be so much better off if I can have this waiting in her inbox when she comes into work tomorrow. When I decide to stay because I care about my colleague and because I care about my team, yeah, on a certain level, I guess everything could be considered selfish. I want to maintain my relationships. I want to maintain my status on the team. I want to be appreciated. I want to be appreciative. But the general idea is that I'm doing it. The motivation for doing it is because I want the group to succeed. That's where my motivation is that I'm looking at the aspirations of a collective unit. Whereas in transactional, it's much more direct. I am doing this either to avoid your punishment or to receive your reward, and I can make a straight line from one to the other. So I would say that the more that the motivators are tangible, like a raise or a demotion, we're dealing with transactional stuff. When we start to say, well, perhaps the transactions are feelings, and perhaps what we're describing is you feel a strong sense of identity with this group. You feel a strong sense of commitment to me because I've treated you well. These are the kinds of things where we're now dealing with transformational. And the effect is ultimately also, am I doing this for the benefit of me or am I doing this for the benefit of the group? Is a really important distinguishing point. And I will say, having worked for both, it's extraordinary what the difference in the experience between working for a transformational leader and a transactional one. For me at least, it spills over into every other aspect of my life, including what kind of mood I'm in when I go home. All right, well, I wish everyone continued success and the best of luck in your future endeavors, and I hope that, I'm not sure that there's anything specific that you'll take away from this other than to think about all of these things that are sort of happening unconsciously around us all, and maybe that will make it a little bit easier to start to conceptualize how we can navigate and get to where we want to be. So with that, I say good luck and thank you again.